My name is Dr. Lee Moore, and this is Podcast Taiwan, Literature, a podcast on the history, literature, society, and culture of the world's most fascinating island, brought to you by the National Museum of Taiwan Literature. Today, we are talking about Huang Chunming, one of the great writers of Taiwan literature's Nativist school. Huang Chunming was born on February 13th, 1935. He's 88 today. He was born in modern-day Yilan. That's on the other side of the mountains from Taipei. So if you go take the train east through the mountains, you will wind up in Yilan. He was the youngest of 5 children. His mother died when he was 8. He dropped out of middle school in Yilan because of abuse at the hands of a stepmother. He moved to Taipei, where he looked for work in an electrical appliance store in Taipei. He then studied for himself and was admitted to Taipei Normal School. He's forced to leave several times as he goes in and out of these normal schools. They're college-level, university-level schools to train teachers. The same thing happens several times. He bounces around. Finally, in 1958, he graduates from Pingdong Teachers College and works in an elementary school as a teacher for 3 years. In 1950, while in middle school, Huang Chunming meets a teacher, Wang Xianqun. This teacher introduced him to literature and was the one to really change his life and put him on the journey to becoming a writer. Wang introduced Huang Chunming to several writers who are highly influential in Huang's work. So Chekhov in Russia, Shen Congwen, and Ba Jian in China. Wang Xiaoqun was unfortunately killed as a part of the White Terror. The government in Taiwan led a state terror campaign against many of its citizens during the 1950s, as we discussed in an earlier podcast. Wang Xiaoqun, Huang Chunming's teacher, was one of the victims. This introduction to literature helped spark Huang Chunming's interest in literature. He published his first major story, The Man and the Little Knife, in 1966. It was focused on an egocentric philosophy or an existentialist philosophy. If you think about it, this is published in 1966. We're only 6 years after the death of Camus. Sartre and other existentialist philosophers, writers are still at the height of their literary influence. Huang Chunming is someone who's early on in his literary exploration. He's very keyed in to the broader global literary trends that are happening around the world. Huang Chunming's fame in Taiwan literature today comes not from his existentialist work, but from works that he wrote starting in the late 1960s and very much into the 1970s. I should remind the listener where Taiwanese politics stands at this point. In 1945, Taiwan stopped being a colony of Japan. It was taken control of by the KMT, a political party that ran much of China at the time. The KMT lost China, but it was able to build a dictatorship on Taiwan in the latter half of the 1940s. The KMT's last holdout for power was in Taiwan. The KMT brutally enforced its dictatorship through a campaign of state-sponsored terror, what we were talking about before, the campaign that took the life of Wang Xiaoqun, Huang's teacher. One of the things that could get you in trouble politically during this time, during the KMT dictatorship, was advocating for Taiwan's independence. This could get you killed, it could get you thrown in jail. There was a variety of unpleasant outcomes that could be the consequence of advocating for Taiwan's independence. The reason for that being, during the dictatorship from 1945 to 1987, the KMT's governing legitimacy rested on returning to China in order to retake China from the Chinese Communist Party. Their entire governing ideology was constructed around this single idea. Therefore, it was very dangerous to advocate for Taiwan's independence or to do anything else that the government perceived as advocating for Taiwan as a historical subject, because that would undercut the legitimacy of the dictatorship. Therefore, schools would oftentimes beat students who spoke Taiwanese rather than Mandarin. Museums in Taiwan were basically not allowed to discuss Taiwan. They were only allowed to discuss China as a historical subject. Archaeologists weren't allowed to do any research on Taiwan because if you're digging up stuff in Taiwan, that gives Taiwan a history that's separate from the rest of China. That is all to say what Huang Chunming, the writer, did in his writing was actually quite brave. Huang Chunming helped launch the Nativist literary movement. In Mandarin, that's Shangtu Wenshui. Sometimes it's translated as native place literature, hometown literature, home place literature. There are a variety of different ways to translate this phrase. But basically, this nativist literary genre was first developed in China in the 1920s. You have writers like Lu Xun and Mao Dun developing this genre of nativist literature in the Chinese tradition. They're drawing off of translations of a German genre called Heimatroman. This is the German genre focused mostly on literary output that expressed local color. Of course, Lu Xun and Mao Dun, these are Chinese writers. They're writing not about Taiwan, but they're writing about their own situation in China. It's not until the late 1960s and early 1970s that you have an outpouring of nativist literature in Taiwan itself, and Huang Chunming is the most representative member of this genre in Taiwan. When someone asks, who's the best example of Taiwan's nativist literature, most people are going to point to Huang Chunming. Huang Chunming produced a wealth of short stories during this period. You have some of his most famous stories, The Taste of Apples. This is about a man who gets run over by an American military official working in Taiwan. The story is dominated by questions of differentials in power between local Taiwanese folks and the American military officials there. Sayonara Zaijian, which of course sayonara and Zaijian are just the Japanese and Chinese words for goodbye. This is a story told from the perspective of a Taiwanese man having to be a tour guide for these rich Japanese sex tourists as they whore their way through Taiwan. Another story, My Son's Big Doll, is about a man who, because of poverty, has to dress up in a clown-like suit and wear a sandwich board to work as a walking advertisement, as a way to get his family enough money to just get by. So again, there's a concern with poverty. The Drowning of an Old Cat is about a local Taiwanese man who protests changes in local laws by drowning himself. The cat here is actually a reference to the man. There's a Taiwanese slang word where old cat refers to a very old man. Two things stand out about Huang Chunming's work, as you can already see. First, he's a master of the short story. That is the main form in which Huang Chunming writes. Second, Huang is very focused on Taiwanese issues. His use of the phrase old cat to signify old man, this is something that if you didn't already know Taiwanese slang, you're probably not going to get. You have to have someone teach you that if you're not someone who's familiar with Taiwanese slang. Sayonara Zaijian and The Taste of Apples, these stories are both focused on how Taiwanese people have been the victims of outsiders, how they're exploited by outsiders. Today, the story we're going to look at is a work that I think is one of his most representative works. It's called just The Fish. In Chinese, it's Yu. It's one of his most famous short stories. It's written early on in his career. It's featured in lots of anthologies. The story, it was required reading in Taiwanese middle school textbooks. It's one of the first Taiwanese stories that I personally read in a class on Taiwanese short stories. It's featured in the anthology Taiwan 现代短篇小说选, selections of modern Taiwanese short stories, which I still have. That was one of the reference books I used to come up with this podcast. The story of The Fish, on the surface, is a fairly simple story. I'm going to explain it, and then we'll dive into some of the broader issues that Huang is dealing with. The story is divided into three parts. In the opening part, you have a grandfather and a grandson. In the original Mandarin, the grandfather is referred to as A Gong. The boy is referred to as A Cang. A Gong literally just means kind of grandfather. But these names, they have a very Taiwanese flavor. Any name that begins with that ah sound, to me, has this very Taiwanese sense. Taiwanese folks love to use ah on names to make them sound cool and local and very Taiwanese. The first president of Taiwan from the DPP political party, His name was Chen Shui-bian, but Taiwanese supporters loved calling him Ah-bian. So just in terms of naming conventions, this story already frames itself as having a very Taiwanese feel to it by invoking this sense of a local Taiwanese identity in the naming structure. Back to the plot. Ah Chang, the grandson, is working down in the city. He's apprenticed to a carpenter, so he's laboring away without getting paid much. He gets paid a little, but not much. He's not always doing carpentry. The family is often exploiting him just to get him to clean up the house or do other kinds of chores. The grandfather and the grandson are talking as the grandson, Ah Chang, is visiting his grandfather up in the hills above the city. The grandfather asks Ah Chang to, if he can, next time he returns, bring the family a fish. That's the main question of the story is, will he bring this fish? The grandfather says, if you could do it, that'd be great. But the grandfather also gives him all of these possible outs. If the fish aren't coming in today, if the ships aren't bringing fish in, you know what? Don't worry about it. If you don't have any money, you know what? Don't worry about it. In the second part of the story, we see the grandfather and Ah Chang, the grandson, walking to the bus stop, waiting for the bus to go back into the city where the carpenter is. They're talking about the fish. There is almost this sense that you can taste the fish and how delicious it's going to be in the way that they talk about it. They're really kind of appreciating the fish simply through their discussions of the fish. In the third part of the story, we watch Ah Chang. He has the fish. He's got a bonito. That's a kind of tuna that's fairly common in the waters around Taiwan. But although it is not a very expensive fish, it was at the time a fish that was fairly difficult for poor people in Taiwan to buy. I don't know why that was. That's just what my Taiwanese literature professor told the class. So he has this bonito tuna. It's not easy to get, and apparently Ah Chang has had to scrimp and save up just to get this fish. So he returns home, not by bus, but instead he decides to borrow a bicycle, puts the bonito up on the handlebars, and he bikes home. But the problem is the bike's not very good, and as he is riding it, something happens with the chain of the bicycle, and the fish falls off the handlebars and gets thrown into the road and run over by some trucks. In other words, it's a disaster. Ah Chang returns home, but then the weird things start happening. And I'm going to be completely honest, after reading and rereading the story, I still don't feel like I fully understand what Huang Chunming is going. But that's okay. Ah Chang returns home and he tells his grandfather that he lost the fish. And the grandfather gives Ah Chang all of these outs again. He says, oh, maybe what you actually mean is they didn't have the fish today. And Ah Chang insists again and again and again that he did have the fish. He just dropped it. But the grandfather doesn't believe him. And they get into this huge argument, and the grandfather actually threatens Ah Chang. He says he should never come back home again. He uses a very hurtful language. And then the final word in the story, and it is haunting. We hear Ah Chang's voice echoing back from the mountains across the valley, insisting that he did have the fish. He just dropped it. It's as if the mountains, nature itself, is advocating for Ah Chang and trying to convince the grandfather that no, Ah Chang is not lying, that he did actually drop the fish. He did get the fish, but he dropped. That's the plot. My first question, and it's a question that I've struggled with since I first read this story almost 10 years ago. Why doesn't the grandfather accept Ah Chang's explanation? He accepts other possibilities. Why does the grandfather have to cause a fight with Ah Chang over this one thing? Especially, why does he have to do it when Ah Chang is actually telling the truth? I'm not going to lie to you. I don't have a good answer for you. But I think that one of the things that elevates good literature to great literature is unresolved questions. If everything in a story is easy to understand, it's not great literature. Easy literature is bad literature. As I was struggling to understand the reason for Grandpa's behavior, I came to think maybe grandfather thinks that these other reasons, the likelihood that Ah Chang just did not have the money or something else, he thinks that these reasons are much more plausible. And when he gives Ah Chang an out, he wants him to fess up to his lie. And when Atang doesn't fess up to what grandfather thinks is a lie, grandfather just loses it. But still, that doesn't really make sense to me. Huang Chunming's portrayal of Atang and grandfather, they're so sympathetic up to this point. It doesn't add up. Why would he make grandfather out to suddenly act kind of like a jerk? I'm just going to say it. He's kind of acting like a jerk. The best explanation that I've come up with is maybe it is because grandfather is so morally upright that he is unwilling to allow his grandson to continue to insist on this white lie, what he believes to be a white lie, when in fact he thinks he's given sufficient outs to Atang. There's a point in this story where the grandfather and Atang are talking about some event in the past, and grandfather is telling Atang about how he got a fish at this point in the past. Atang asked him straight up if grandpa was ever thinking about stealing that fish. And the grandfather acts surprised, and he tells Atang, you can never do that. You can never steal the fish. So there is this real sense of honor attached to the grandfather character. Maybe as an explanation, grandfather feels that Atang has violated that sense of honor, and that is why he is unwilling to believe Atang. That's the best explanation that I have come up with, but still, I'm not 100% on that. I'm very much struggling with this story. Another thing I want to point out about this story, Huang Chunming is acutely aware of the sufferings of those at the bottom of society, and that's something that he wants to draw attention to with this story. That seems to be one of the main reasons Huang wrote this piece, to portray the sufferings of those at the lowest level of society. At several points, Huang discusses how exploited these people are. At one point, Grandpa and Atang talk about how everyone on the poor land in the hills above the city owes money to the rich farmers down in the better farmland below, right next to the city. So we have, quote, who owed him money, end quote. Who up here on the mountain doesn't owe the money to the flatlanders, end quote. So there's this discussion about different levels of society and people who have farmland on the good land and people who have farms on the bad land, and how that creates the stratification where one group always owes money to the next. Another thing, Atang seems to be exploited by the carpenter's family. There seems to be this critique of capitalistic exploitation of Atang by the carpenter, and capitalistic exploitation of the merchants in the market who are always exploiting the people who don't have as much money. So I'm going to read another passage. Quote, they robbed me of a load of sweet potatoes. Those people are bandits, pure and simple. I was so upset, I fretted over it for days, end quote. So that's just a discussion of the merchants in the market and the way they rob poor people. The final point I want to make about this story is how it highlights the Taiwanese-ness of these characters. I mentioned early on that these characters feel very Taiwanese because of the naming conventions. Atang, Agong, these are all very Taiwanese names, as we would say in Taiwan.很Tai, very Taiwanese. Huang Chunming also uses elements of the Taiwanese language. Now, I have to go back and explain the difference between Taiwanese and Mandarin and the linguistic situation on Taiwan. So Taiwanese is a language that is different from Mandarin. It's as different as French is from Italian. And Taiwan has a strange linguistic setup. 83% of the people in Taiwan speak Mandarin as their first language, while 81% of the people in Taiwan speak Taiwanese as their first language. In other words, there's a heck of a lot of overlap between Taiwanese speakers and Mandarin speakers, and a lot of people are bilingual to the extent that they speak both Mandarin and Taiwanese as their first languages, as their mother tongues. They speak both languages inside their home. You have other smaller languages thrown into the mix on the island. So Hakka, another Chinese language, has, I think, something like 15% of people in Taiwan speak that as their mother tongue. You have indigenous Taiwanese languages, which make up about 1.4% of the mother tongues of different peoples on Taiwan. But Taiwanese and Mandarin really dominate the linguistic landscape. And Huang Chunming writes the story in Mandarin, but he sprinkles the story with Taiwanese phrases. Certain things that if you're not familiar with Taiwanese slang, it's just harder to get. So linguistically, he is making this story written in Mandarin into a story that has a very Taiwanese flavor. Also, the story's setting is very Taiwanese. The story is about Yilan. That's where Huang Chunming is from. But it's also a place in Taiwan that has a deep sense of a Taiwanese identity. At the time that Huang Chunming is writing the story, it's a point where we are starting to see Taiwanese resistance to the KMT imposing that Chinese identity on the Taiwanese people, what I talked about earlier on in this episode. Yilan is one of the places where that resistance is strongest. So by situating his story in Yilan, it is, along with other things, making it a story that is very evocative of a Taiwanese identity. Huang Chunming mostly writes about Yilan. Yilan is his go-to site when he writes about a place. I don't think all of his stories are set in Yilan, but many of them are. And I think that's actually a pretty good place to wrap up this discussion of Huang Chunming. With Huang Chunming, you have a writer who's concerned with the poorest people in society. He's also focused on creating this very Taiwanese sensibility in his stories. That is one of the things that makes him one of the great figures of the Nativist literature movement, 乡土文学运动. And that's one of the reasons he is such an important writer in Taiwan. All right, that's it for me. My name is Dr. Lee Moore, and this is Podcast Taiwan Literature, a podcast on the history, literature, society, and culture of the world's most fascinating islands. Until next time, I'll sign off by saying thank you in Taiwanese. 多谢